Nobody recognized Jesus after he rose from the dead, not even the people who had lived with him for 3 years. Mary Magdalene saw him from less than 2 meters away and thought he was the gardener. 2 disciples walked with him for hours along a road and didn't know who he was until he broke bread. Peter was on a boat 100 meters from shore, heard his voice, and didn't identify it. Thomas declared he wouldn't believe unless he put his fingers into the wounds with his own hands. Something had happened to that body that was much deeper than simply coming back from the dead. Let me ask you a direct question. If your best friend, someone you ate thousands of meals with, crossed storms with, slept at camp with for 3 years, if that person showed up tomorrow in front of you, would you be unable to recognize them? Your logical answer is that would be impossible, and yet that was exactly what happened to the people who knew Jesus of Nazareth best. Not once, repeatedly, over 40 days documented by at least 4 first-century writers. And the account of those weeks works like a hidden code in the texts, where each appearance reveals a distinct layer of something you can't grasp if you read them separately. The first layer is in the nature of the body, the second in who controlled the recognition, the third in a Greek verb that appears only twice in the entire Bible, the fourth in a charcoal fire that echoes another earlier charcoal fire, and the fifth changes the reading of all of human history. Let's break this down layer by layer. The first layer is the most disturbing of all because it presents 2 sets of facts that cannot coexist in any known category of reality. Luke, chapter 24, verse 39. Jesus is standing in front of his disciples in a room with the doors shut. Nobody opened any entrance. Nobody heard footsteps. One instant there was nobody, and the next he was there, standing in the middle of them. The first reaction was pure terror, not joy, not relief, terror. They thought they were seeing a ghost, an apparition, something generated by grief and the accumulated fear of that week. And it was Jesus himself who cut the panic with a sentence that Luke records without embellishment. A spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you can see that I have. He showed his hands, he showed his feet, he told them to touch him. He told them to verify, and then, as if wanting to close off any possible alternative interpretation, he asked for food. There was broiled fish in the room. He took it and ate it in front of all of them. Luke, chapter 24, verse 43. A being without physical matter has nothing to digest. A spirit doesn't need food. What was there had the functional capacity to feed itself like a living body. But that same body that ate broiled fish and had bones that could be touched had entered a room with locked doors without anyone opening them. John, chapter 20, verse 19. And when he appeared in Emmaus, seated at the table with 2 disciples, he broke the bread, handed it over, and vanished before anyone could react. Luke, chapter 24, verse 31. He didn't get up slowly. He didn't leave through the door. He vanished. Those 2 sets of data don't fit into any category that human biology knows. A physical body obeys the laws of space, occupies place, doesn't pass through solid matter. An immaterial being doesn't eat or have bones. What the disciples were describing was a third thing that had not existed before that moment in history. And here comes something most people overlook when they read these texts. Paul, writing to the community in Corinth years later, used an expression that sounds paradoxical but is the most precise one available in the first-century Greek language. Spiritual body. First letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 44. Paul wasn't saying the body had dissolved into spirit. He was saying the matter of that body obeyed a different logic, an order that went beyond the known physical laws. He used an agricultural image to explain it. The seed you bury in the ground doesn't have the same form as the plant that grows from it. What dies and what rises again have continuity, but they are not identical in their relationship to the physical world. And that distinction is what separates the risen Jesus from the risen Lazarus. Lazarus came back only to die again someday. His body was still subject to the same laws of decay as before. What happened with Jesus was something else entirely. The same Jesus, the same person, the same memory, the same wounds, but in an existence no longer subject to corruption or the limits of space. He ate because he could, not because he needed to. He entered wherever he wanted because physical barriers no longer had authority over that body. The wounds remained open, not because he was suffering, but because they functioned as proof and memory at the same time. The visible signature of something that had occurred and would not be erased. That's the first layer. But the second is stranger still. Because the problem wasn't just what kind of body he had, but why nobody could recognize him. The smell of spices cut through the cold air of the early morning. Myrrh mixed with aloe, the weight of the jars pulling at the hands of a woman walking alone toward a tomb where she expected to find a corpse. Mary Magdalene arrived at the garden before daylight touched the horizon. John chapter 20, verse 1. She knew what she was going to find. A stone impossible to move alone, Roman guards, the body of someone to whom she owed everything. What she found was emptiness. The stone rolled away, the guards gone, and inside the tomb the linen wrappings folded on the floor with an order that didn't match robbery or haste. She ran. She told Peter and John. They came, looked, didn't understand, and left. She stayed. That decision not to leave defines everything that comes next, because it was right there, crying alone by the entrance of the open tomb, that she became the first person in history to see the risen one with her own eyes. John chapter 20, verse 14. She turned around, and there was a man standing there whom she didn't recognize. She thought he was the gardener. She asked him if he had moved the body. She said she would search for it herself if he told her where it was. And then he said her name. A single word. Mary. The tone with which he said it contained something no gardener would use. She turned around completely and said in Aramaic, Rabboni, teacher. John chapter 20, verse 16. But what follows immediately after carries a strangeness that almost nobody notices. Jesus said to her, Do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. John chapter 20, verse 17. That phrase is not distancing, not rejection after such a charged reunion. It's an indication that something was still in process in that risen body. He was there, he spoke, he saw, he heard, he knew her name with the same voice as always. But something was happening in that existence that had not yet been completed. A transition that the very act of rising was still finalizing. She didn't touch him, and he gave her an immediate instruction. Go and tell my brothers that I ascend to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary of Magdala was then the first person to preach the resurrection. Before any apostle opened his mouth for a sermon, it was she who carried the news of the empty tomb to the men hiding in a locked room in Jerusalem. But there's a detail that goes unnoticed and that contains the key to the second layer. She was less than 2 meters away from someone she had walked with for years, someone whose voice she had heard hundreds of times, and she didn't recognize him until he spoke her name. This wasn't distraction. It wasn't the effect of grief. The biblical text itself says it with a precision that eliminates those alternative explanations. On the road to Emmaus, Luke records exactly what was happening. Chapter 24, verse 16. Their eyes were restrained so that they would not recognize him. That sentence is devastating. It doesn't say Jesus had changed his appearance. It doesn't say they were too sad to pay attention. It says there was an active block on their perception. And the Greek word Luke uses, krateo, implies deliberate restraint, control exercised with intention. Jesus was actively controlling when and how he was recognized. And that changes the reading of every appearance. because if the non-recognition was a decision of his, then the appearances weren't just proofs that he had risen. They were designed encounters with a specific pedagogical order that no one has read correctly unless they put all the pieces together. Think about it from an angle that maybe was never presented to you. Why didn't Jesus show up immediately at the temple? Why didn't he appear before Pilate, before Caiaphas, before the very people who had condemned him? If the goal was to prove he had risen, the most efficient strategy would have been to appear before those who killed him and close the case once and for all. But he didn't do that. What he did was exactly the opposite. He appeared first to a woman whom the culture of the time didn't consider a legally valid witness, then to two second-tier disciples walking along a rural road, then to a group locked away in fear, and in none of those encounters did he present himself as who he was before understanding arrived first. At Emmaus, he walked for hours with two of them, explaining the scriptures to them, from Moses to the prophets, building a complete reading of the entire Hebrew tradition that pointed to a Messiah who needed to suffer before entering into glory. Luke chapter 24, verse 26. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and thus enter into his glory? Hours of explanation. And during all that time, they didn't recognize him. One of the two was named Cleopas. The other has no name in the record, which suggests that Luke left him unidentified because his original audience already knew who he was. When they arrived near the village, Jesus acted as if he were going to continue on the road. They insisted he stay because the evening was already falling and the road at night was dangerous. He went in with them, sat at the table, took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and handed it to them. Luke says that in that instant their eyes were opened, verse 31. The same verb from the earlier block now operated in the opposite direction. What had been restrained was released in a single gesture at the table. They recognized him, and he vanished immediately from their sight before anyone could react. One of them said to the other something that reveals what had been happening beneath the surface during the entire walk. Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? Verse 32. They had felt something the entire way, but they couldn't name it while it was happening. The revelation of who he was came at the end, after the teaching had prepared the ground. And that was not accidental, it was deliberate architecture. Seeing first and understanding later would have produced followers who believed because they had seen. Understanding first and recognizing later produced something much harder to tear down. They got up immediately, even though it was already night, and walked the 11 kilometers back to Jerusalem. When they arrived at the upper room where the 11 were gathered, before they could tell what had happened on the road, the others were already talking. The Lord has truly risen and appeared to Simon Peter. Luke chapter 24, verse 34. If this is making you rethink what you thought you knew about those 40 days, wait for what comes next. Because the third layer involves a gesture that connects directly to the first chapter of the Bible. While the two stories were meeting in that room, Jesus appeared again in the middle of them. But this time there was no request for food, no invitation to touch the wounds. What came was completely different from everything that had happened before. Jesus looked at them and said, "Peace to you. As the Father sent me, I also send you." John chapter 20, verse 21. And then he did something that none of those present had ever seen. Something that didn't exist as a ritual gesture, as a religious protocol, as part of any tradition they knew. He breathed on them. John chapter 20, verse 22. And he said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." The gesture itself, separated from any context, is already disturbing in its intimacy. Breathing on someone is not a public act, not a ceremony, not a declaration to a crowd. It is something that happens up close, between people, with a proximity that presupposes absolute trust. In a room with 11 men, Jesus breathed on them as if he were transferring something that couldn't be delivered any other way. And here is the third layer, the word that changes everything. The word translated as breathed is enephisesin in the original Greek. And that word appears in only one other place in the entire Greek biblical tradition. In the translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, in chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 7, when God forms man from the dust of the earth and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. The same verb, the same gesture, the same transfer of life through direct breath. John was not being poetic in choosing that word. He was pointing to a correspondence that reorganized the entire reading of human history. The first creation had begun with a divine breath over inert matter, and what had come from that act was a living being capable of communion with God. The second creation was beginning in the same way, with the same intimacy, but now over people who already existed biologically and were receiving through the breath a dimension of life that biology alone could not produce. Paul develops this idea with a precision that leaves no room for metaphor. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, he calls Jesus the last Adam, who became a life-giving spirit. The first Adam received life. The last Adam distributed life. Jesus was positioning himself not as a symbolic title, but as the functional head of a humanity that was being rebooted. And he did it with a gesture that has a parallel only in the original act of creation. And the difference between that moment and the Pentecost that would come 50 days later needs to be understood by the nature of the gesture, not by the intensity. At Pentecost, the Spirit descended on 120 people gathered in one place. Acts chapter 2. It came as a mighty wind and visible flames. The result was immediate and public. Tongues, proclamation, 3,000 people responding in a single morning. It was a launch, it was power on a collective scale. What happened in the locked upper room was different in its essence. There was no wind, no flame, no visible external sign. It was a personal breath from someone who was inches away, delivering something that could not be seen, but that changed the spiritual condition of whoever received it. It was the birth before the launch, the seed planted before the harvest. Without that breath, Pentecost would be power without root. With it, what would descend 50 days later would find people who had already received the seed of what was arriving in fullness. And there's something that most theological studies treat with academic distance, but that is actually deeply disturbing when you think about it from the inside. Imagine you're a teenager in your last year of high school. Your philosophy teacher asks you in front of the whole class if you really believe that a dead man rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. Everyone is looking at you. The rational answer the room expects is a polite denial or a comfortable silence. But you know what you know, and what you know didn't come from a book you read. It came from something that happened inside you that you can't explain with the vocabulary that classroom accepts. The disciples in that room after the breath knew something they couldn't name yet either, but something had changed in the atmosphere, a quality of presence that wasn't there before the gesture. And that presence was the same one that would explode publicly 50 days later with wind and fire and 3,000 people responding in a single morning. But Thomas wasn't in that room that night. He didn't see, he didn't touch, he didn't hear the explanation, he didn't receive the breath. And when the others told him, with eyes still charged from what they had experienced, he responded with an almost clinical precision. John chapter 20, verse 25. Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe. 8 days passed, and what happened at the end of those 8 days contains the highest confession a human being had uttered up to that moment in history. 8 days of Thomas living alongside 11 men who said they had seen the impossible, and him holding firm to his demand. Until Jesus appeared again, with the doors equally shut, stood in the middle of them, and went directly toward Thomas. Not toward Peter, not toward John, toward the one who had set the strictest conditions. He told him to reach out his finger, to see the hands, to put his hand in the side, to stop doubting and believe. John, chapter 20, verse 27. What Thomas said in response was not a conventional religious declaration of faith. It was the highest confession any human being had uttered up to that point. My Lord and my God. Verse 28. He didn't say teacher, he didn't say prophet, he didn't say Messiah, he said God. And Jesus didn't correct him. What came next was a sentence directed not only at Thomas, but at every person who would read that text over the following 2,000 years. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Verse 29. That sentence pierces the parchment and reaches you who are reading this right now without having put your finger into any wound. If what you just heard shook something inside you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit like and turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming. But before the public mission, before the cosmic declaration that would change history, there was one more layer. One that involved a single man, a fire on the beach, and a question repeated 3 times. From Mount Arbel, you can see the entire Sea of Galilee spread out like a sheet of dark metal when the moon is high. The local fishermen know the nighttime currents. They know the best hours are between midnight and dawn. And they know that a fishless night isn't rare, but it is frustrating. Peter had said he was going fishing. John chapter 21 verse 3. The other 6 went with him, probably because standing around in a room waiting without knowing exactly what to wait for was unbearable in its own way. They fished all night and caught nothing. When dawn began to lighten the horizon over the lake, there was a man standing on the shore whom they didn't recognize from a distance. He called out asking if they had any fish. They said no. He told them to cast the net on the right side of the boat. Experienced fishermen don't follow instructions from strangers on the shore about where to cast the net. But they cast it, and the net was so full they couldn't haul it into the boat. John turned to Peter and said, "It is the Lord." Peter didn't wait for the boat to reach shore. He tied his clothes around his waist and threw himself into the water. When the others arrived, dragging the net, there was a charcoal fire burning in the sand, with fish and bread cooking on top. Jesus told them to bring some of the fish they had caught. Peter went back to the boat, hauled the net alone to shore, and counted 153 large fish. And the net had not torn. John chapter 21, verse 11. That number is recorded with a precision that is not characteristic of decorative details. Jerome, in the 4th century, documented that 153 was the number of fish species catalogued in the known world at the time. The net that didn't break, containing every species represented, was an image that any Jew with training in the scriptures would have read as a symbol of the universal mission about to be declared. Every nation, every people, every language included, without a single one being lost. But before any mission declaration, there was breakfast. Jesus said, "Come and eat," John chapter 21, verse 12. None of them dared to ask who he was, because they knew it was the Lord. The meal passed in silence, or at least John didn't record any conversation. It was early, the fire was warm, the smell of roasting fish mixed with charcoal smoke filled the air on the shore, and there was something heavy that nobody knew how to name. Peter knew it, and here comes a detail that destroys the idea that these texts are casual accounts written without literary intention. The Greek word John uses to describe that fire is anthrakia, a charcoal fire. That same word, with the same specificity, appears in only one other place in the entire New Testament. In the courtyard of the high priest, on the night Jesus was arrested, where the servants and the guards had lit a charcoal fire to warm themselves. John chapter 18, verse 18. And Peter was standing with them when he was asked 3 times if he knew the man they had arrested. 3 times he said no. John doesn't use the word anthrachia twice by coincidence. In a text constructed with the attention that the 4th gospel demonstrates in every detail, that vocabulary choice is deliberate architecture. Jesus had recreated the physical setting of the denial. The cold of the early morning, the smell of smoke, the warmth of the coals, so that the restoration would happen exactly where the rupture had happened. Not in spite of the memory, but within it. If you ever carried something you did wrong, and nobody mentioned it, but the weight was there every time you saw that person. If a parent ever sat with you at the table after trust had been broken, and didn't start with accusation, but with food and silence, if you ever experienced something that resembled that, then you understand what Peter was living on that shore before Jesus opened his mouth. When the meal was over, Jesus turned to him and asked, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" Peter said, "Yes." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." He asked again. Peter answered again. Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." He asked a 3rd time, and Peter was grieved because it was the 3rd time. He answered that Jesus knew all things and knew that he loved him. Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." John chapter 21, verses 15 through 17, 3 denials, 3 restorations, each affirmation of love overwriting a previous denial, not as a healing ritual, but as a real conversation between 2 people who had gone through something that didn't need to be named to be understood by both. The mission Jesus would declare afterward needed a whole Peter, not a Peter split in half by the guilt of what he had done in that courtyard. The restoration wasn't pastoral kindness. It was strategic preparation for what was about to be declared. If what you just heard touched something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit like on this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you these documentaries. And if you want to support this work, the Super Thanks button is right here below, or you can become a member of the channel. We've also left some products in the description for anyone who wants to strengthen the project. Now, let's get back. Because what comes next is the layer that changes the scale of everything before it. Paul, in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 6, records an appearance that the 4 Gospels simply didn't describe. Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at the same time, not in sequence, not in separate groups throughout the 40 days, all at once. And the detail Paul adds immediately afterward transforms that record into something of a completely different nature. He writes that the majority of those people were still alive when the letter was sent. That was written approximately 22 years after the resurrection. Paul wasn't preserving a tradition for the future. He was pointing to contemporary witnesses, people who could be found, interrogated, confronted with the direct question about what they had seen. That was a risky bet to make in writing. Jerusalem during that period was a city under occupation and constant surveillance. The priests who had orchestrated Jesus' condemnation had a vital interest in discrediting any resurrection account before it gained public traction. Rome had its own reasons to maintain order and suppress movements that might grow around condemned figures. In such a scenario, organizing a gathering of more than 500 people around someone the state had publicly executed was not only improbable from a logistical standpoint, it was dangerous in a very concrete way. Most scholars who work with the geography of that period point to Galilee as the most likely location for such a large gathering. Jesus had instructed the disciples before the crucifixion that he would meet them in Galilee after rising. Matthew records it, and the angel at the empty tomb repeats the notice for the women. Matthew chapter 28, verse 7. Galilee was about 100 kilometers from Jerusalem. It was the region where most of Jesus' followers had their roots and was far enough from the center of priestly power to allow a large-scale gathering without the same immediate exposure. 500 people is not a number that gathers by accident. Someone coordinated, someone communicated, someone chose the place and the moment. In a period when communication depended on physical messengers traveling real distances, that represented a deliberate operation carried out under real risk of reprisal, and no Roman or priestly authority ever produced a documented refutation. And this is what almost nobody mentions when talking about this appearance. Paul put in writing a datum that any person in Corinth could verify by crossing the Mediterranean and asking in Jerusalem or in Galilee. He was betting all his apostolic credibility on a number and on the claim that the sources were still breathing. No ancient record cites a single one of the 500 witnesses who retracted the account. The silence around that absence of denial is itself a datum that historians of the period take seriously. But what the gathering of 500 people reveals more than any individual datum is the scale of what was being built during those 40 days. The encounters in the locked room, the walk to Emmaus, the breath over the 11, the charcoal fire with Peter, all of that was intimate and deep. But there was also this moment where Jesus appeared before a multitude, as if wanting to ensure that the testimony of the resurrection wouldn't depend on a group too small to be dismissed as collective illusion or a conspiracy of a few. 500 voices are hard to silence. 500 simultaneous memories of the same event are hard to discredit with accusations of deception or hallucination. And what I'm about to tell you will probably make you uncomfortable, but it is the layer that holds up all the others. The 40 days ended on a mountain, the Mount of Olives, the same place from which Jesus had descended in a triumphal entry days before the crucifixion, the same where he had prayed the night he was arrested. The path was familiar in a way that carried weight in every step. Matthew records that some still doubted when they saw him. Chapter 28, verse 17. Even after everything, even with the appearances, the touched wounds, the fish eaten in front of them, there were those who arrived at that encounter carrying a doubt that hadn't fully resolved. Jesus didn't treat the doubt as an obstacle. He walked toward them, and the first thing that came from his mouth wasn't instruction, wasn't a task, wasn't what readers know as the Great Commission. It was a declaration about authority. Matthew, chapter 28, verse 18, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Only after that statement came the words, "Therefore, go." The sequence isn't rhetorical, it's structural. The entire mission depended on what had been declared before it, because sending people without real authority over the territory where they were being sent would be gesturing in the dark. And to understand the magnitude of what was being declared, you have to go back to a text that the rabbinic tradition always took seriously. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8. When the nations were scattered at Babel, God distributed them according to the number of the sons of Israel, and each nation was placed under the oversight of celestial beings, spiritual authorities, that the tradition called princes of the nations. Daniel chapter 10 describes one of those princes as the Prince of Persia, a being that resisted for 3 weeks, a divine messenger sent to answer Daniel's prayer. The nations were not merely geographical territories, they were spiritual domains with real sovereignties over them. When Jesus declared that all authority in heaven and on earth had been transferred to him, he was saying that the structure of delegation established at Babel had been reconfigured. The princes of the nations had not been destroyed, but the supreme authority over every territory they occupied had passed to another name. This explains why the Greek word for nations is ethne, the same root from which the word ethnic comes. They weren't tourist destinations or abstract categories of people. They were domains with identity, history, rooted spirituality, visible and invisible power structures that had operated for centuries without direct interference from what was being inaugurated on that mountain. Make disciples of all nations was not a friendly invitation. It was a declaration of legitimate occupation of spiritual territories whose sovereignty had changed hands. And then came a promise that sealed the mandate. I am with you always, to the end of the age. Matthew chapter 28, verse 20. The presence that had appeared and vanished throughout the 40 days, that had controlled when and how it was recognized, that had breathed on 11 men in a locked room and fed 7 on a lakeshore. That presence was not promising more physical appearances with fish and coals. It was promising companionship of another nature, continuous, without the intervals of the appearances, without the need to be in the same physical space to be real. But before ascending, something revealing happened. On the way to that final encounter, the disciples asked a question that shows how much misunderstanding still existed, even after everything they had lived through. They asked whether it was at that moment that he would restore the kingdom to Israel. Acts chapter 1, verse 6. 40 days of appearances, open scriptures, breath, coals, a universal mission declared over all nations. And the question was still about political borders and national autonomy. Jesus didn't respond with correction or impatience. He said the times and dates were under the Father's authority, that it was not for them to know. And he added that they would receive power when the Holy Spirit came upon them, and would be witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Acts chapter 1, verse 8. The answer was not a denial of their hope. It was an expansion of the scale to a point where the previous question was too small to fit. After that, he lifted his hands and blessed them. And while he was blessing them, he began to ascend. Luke records in Acts chapter 1, verse 9, that a cloud received him and hid him from their eyes. That cloud was not a meteorological phenomenon. In the Hebrew tradition, the cloud was the perceptible form of God's presence, what the rabbis called the Shekinah. It was the cloud that guided Israel in the wilderness for 40 years. Exodus chapter 13, verse 21. The same one that filled the tabernacle with such intensity that Moses could not enter. Exodus chapter 40, verse 35. The one that rested upon Solomon's temple at its dedication. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 10. When that cloud received Jesus on the Mount of Olives, it was not closure. It was recognition, the same sign that had marked every moment when the divine presence became locatable in the history of Israel, now received back someone who had departed from it with a body that still bore the marks of the nails. 2 men in white appeared beside the paralyzed disciples and asked, "Why do you stand looking into heaven? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come in the same way as you have seen him go." Acts chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. The question was not a reprimand for the emotion of the moment. It was a summons. The interval between the departure and the return was not time for paralysis. It was time for witness, for the occupation of the territories that had been mentioned moments before. What the disciples saw on that mountain was not a man dying again. It was not a farewell. It was an enthronement. In the culture of the ancient world, the king did not remain on the battlefield after victory. He returned to the throne. The war had been won on a cross, confirmed in an empty garden, demonstrated over 40 days of verifiable presence, declared on a mountain before witnesses. What was happening now was the natural sequence, the victor taking his seat. Psalm 2, which any disciple knew by heart, said that God would establish his anointed one and that this anointed one would rule the nations. Psalm 110 verse 1, cited by Jesus more frequently than any other text in the scriptures, said, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." The ascension was not separation, it was positioning. And this is where the layers come together and reveal something that time has not finished unfolding. A physical body with open wounds and the memory of broiled fish on a lakeshore crossed the border between the visible and the invisible. Paul states in Colossians chapter 2 verse 9 that in that glorified body the fullness of the deity dwells in bodily form, not as a symbol, not as a liturgical metaphor, but as a statement about the current condition of someone who exists now in a place that human language does not have sufficient vocabulary to describe with precision. And if he ascended with that body, the question that the first followers could not let go of, the same one Paul develops in 1 Corinthians 15 with all his theological intelligence, remains open for anyone who takes this account seriously. If the first fruit of that resurrection already crossed that border with a transformed body, what does that announce about what the full harvest will be? 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 20. Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The word first fruits is not poetic, it is agricultural. It is the first sample of what comes afterward at full scale. What happened to him is the preview of what is promised for every person who is joined to that name. The same transformed body, the same victory over corruption, the same crossing of the border into an existence that the current laws of matter cannot contain. 40 days. That's how long the interval lasted between the empty garden and the mountain where the cloud received him. And in that interval, layer by layer, something appeared that had not existed before in human history, a body that obeyed a different physics, a recognition controlled by the one being recognized, a breath that repeated the original gesture of creation, a charcoal fire that undid what another charcoal fire had destroyed, 500 voices that could be consulted, a confession that said, "My God," and was not corrected, and an ascension that was not departure but the taking of a throne. All of it points in a direction that theology takes centuries to formulate, but that the wet fisherman who jumped from the boat understood in a single instant when he saw the coals and heard the question. Death was defeated within history, with bones and flesh and memory, and what rises from that defeat is not an idea, nor a moral principle, nor a religion. It is a person who knows your name with the same precision with which he knew Mary's in that garden, who knows exactly which fire he needs to light to find you where you broke, and whose promise to be with you every day does not depend on your seeing him to be true. What you're about to see on screen connects directly to what we just discovered. Click